Hi, I'm John Gossman, and I'm a distinguished engineer in the Azure team. I focus mostly on open source in the cloud, and I'm here today to talk to you about open source at Microsoft. With me is Stormy Peters from the Open Source Program Office. Stormy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm Stormy Peters, and I run Microsoft's Open Source Programs Office, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing with you what we've learned at Microsoft working with open source.
So we're going to start out with talking about a real obvious question, which is why Microsoft and open source? If you've been in a time warp for 20 years, you may be really surprised to find out that Microsoft's doing a lot with open source, because 20 years ago was very famously kind of an opponent of open source. Our former CEO said a lot of bad things about Linux and open source. But things have changed enormously in the world and at Microsoft in that time. And ultimately, it comes down to a few simple things. 20 years ago, there was a lot of misperception, certainly at Microsoft, but elsewhere in the industry, about how the economics of open source work. There was this perception that open source companies couldn't succeed, that it was something only for non-commercial projects. And obviously, starting with Red Hat and a long list of other companies have been extremely successful, even with pure open source projects, as well as doing services and support and projects that incorporate open source. So that was one of the biggest things that changed. It's just the recognition across the industry and at Microsoft of the economic value of open source. But I think there's something deeper than that, and you have to go back all the way even further to Microsoft by a couple of developers, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, developing a developer product, BASIC, for other developers. So Microsoft is at some point a company by, of, and for developers. And one of the things that we know is that developers love open source, including Microsoft developers. So while there's this need inside Microsoft to be involved in the mainstream of development and interest in that, there's also another factor, which is that many of our customers are using open source. Almost all of our customers are really using open source. And so to meet our goal of meeting the customers where they are, we also need to meet developers where they are. With that in mind, Microsoft's open source strategy really kind of involves four major things that we're going to talk about. First of all, is supporting customers who want to use open source solutions. If you want to use Linux or some other open source solution with Microsoft, we want to make sure that that's a great experience. Secondly, we want ourselves to be able to use best of breed open source software like Linux or Spark or Python. All of these things Microsoft people use every day in their work, and it's we want to be able to use that software without concerns. And then we also want to be able to use the power of open source to reach developers and customers with Microsoft-led open source projects. And then finally, this is an ecosystem. And it's important, if you're going to be involved in that ecosystem, to contribute and support all those open source projects. So I love this quote from Satya's book, and it really illustrates some of the stuff I was talking about on the slide earlier. And he's talking about a meeting that he and Scott Guthrie, who runs our cloud business, had probably 8, 9, 10 years ago. And they met with a customer, and this customer was a big Linux user, and they realized that Azure was only going to succeed Linux. And they said, we made that decision by the time we got to the parking lot. But here's the really profound part. He said, this may sound like a purely technical challenge, technical dilemma, but it also posed a profound cultural challenge. And what he was saying there is that we did it half-heartedly. If we were still mostly focused on proprietary source and Windows, we were never going to do a great job at this, and we were just never going to succeed with the Azure cloud business. So there's a case where the CEO, the top management, was actually saying that open source is a critical initiative at Microsoft. And if you combine that with the developers at Microsoft, the employees at Microsoft at the bottom, if you take that top-down and bottom-up interest in open source, then the culture can actually change pretty quickly. So let me just give you a few illustrations of this. I apologize, this slide is a bit of an eye chart, and it actually could be much larger than this because this is only a fraction of the open source work that we're involved in. But it illustrates three parts to our approach. The first one is this enable. We have to enable open source software to work with Microsoft products and services and platforms in order to support our customers. Secondly, we want to release pieces of open source, pieces of software that we developed in open source so that we can take advantage of other people's knowledge and contributions and share that code more easily with customers and partners. And then finally, we want to contribute and partner to the various open source initiatives and companies in the world. So I pulled out a couple of examples here. We've already talked about Linux, enabling Linux, why that was important. Under release, I'm going to talk about TypeScript. If you're not familiar with TypeScript, it's a type-safe language that transpiles to JavaScript, and it's being widely used. It's one of the rapidly becoming one of the most widely used languages in the world. It was developed by Anders Hejlsberg, who some of you may know as the developer of C# language, and before that, Delphi. And if you're as old as I am, you may remember Turbo Pascal. So Anders is one of the most experienced, legendary language designers in the history of the industry, and one of Microsoft's most valuable employees. And his new project, TypeScript, is entirely open source. It's on GitHub. Go look at the repo. Anders is the #1 contributor, and he checks in several times a day. So this is a thing where Anders loves open source, and there's talks you can find about how much, what his experience is. And we have a Microsoft employee, as I say, a developer who is engaged in open source, because that's the way that he thinks his project is going to be most successful, both for him and for the company and for his customers. Now, on the other side, I want to call out the Azure Red Hat OpenShift service under the partner thing. This is a thing where Red Hat has a Kubernetes based PaaS platform called OpenShift. And Microsoft and Red Hat have worked together to build a service that runs on Azure that allows you to run managed OpenShift. And behind that, we have joint support, so that when you call and you have a problem, that Red Hat and Microsoft engineers work together to support your problems with OpenShift. So this is an example of how we're partnering. And there's a long list of these other ones. Databricks, we have a partnership with Spring. We have partnerships with a large number of different companies in this place. Another place what I want to highlight is our contributions to the foundations, like the Linux Foundation. Stormy, I think, is going to talk about a little bit more about that later. Then I called out one more example out of this long list here because it kind of pulls it all together. It talks about enablement, release, and partnerships, and that's SONiC. So SONiC stands for Software for Open Networking in the Cloud. And it's a network operating system. It's based on Debian. It uses Docker containers to manage various network functions. It runs on switches. It runs on basically all the switches in Microsoft's cloud. So it's incredibly mission critical. All of the network traffic in Microsoft clouds runs through these switches running a Debian Linux distribution. So SONiC is an example where we've used the best of class, that the team decided that Linux and Docker and other open source technologies were the best things that they could do to run on these switches. They open sourced it to get it back into the ecosystem in order so that other customers and partners who had similar problems could use SONiC. So they're contributing back to things. And then finally, on the partnership things, it turns out SONiC has got an ecosystem around it. So while it was designed for our usage inside our data centers, now Dell, Broadcom, Cisco, and other major networking providers are actually building commercial products based on SONiC. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stormy to talk about how we do open source.
At Microsoft, I run the Microsoft's Open Source Program Office, and we make sure that it's really easy for teams to use open source software. So at Microsoft, The businesses all decide how to incorporate open source software in their strategy. So like the developer tools team has VS Code and TypeScript. They're developing very much in the open with their users and their customers. Other teams have some proprietary products and some open source products. For example, the Office Windows team has a proprietary product, but also just open source pieces of it, like the Fluid framework. So our job is to help make sure they can do that super easily. And one of the things that I like to think about is Microsoft's mission is to enable individuals and organizations to achieve more. And I think the words through open source fit really nicely behind that. So our team's mission is to enable individuals and organizations to achieve more through open source software. And to give you an idea of the scale or the scope of this problem, at Microsoft, we have over 5 million uses of open source software components. So this may be the same software being used by several teams, but we are tracking 5 million instances of open source software being used around the company. And so we want to make sure that it's really easy and that we have awesome tools to help make that happen. So when a developer at Microsoft downloads open source software and checks it out and plays with it, which they're totally welcome to do, when they put it into their build environment, our build tools will automatically detect that they're using open source software. And at that point, we will go try to find the license. We actually created an open source software project called Clearly Defined that many other organizations and companies are working on with us, where we'll go out and we'll make an API call and find out what the license is. And then depending on what the license is and how the developer said they were going to use it, we'll kick off an approval process. So for most cases, like if it was MIT license and they were just going to use it internally, they would just go ahead and use it and we wouldn't, and there's no review needed in that case. But if the license wasn't clear or if it was a copyleft license that we just wanted to double check how they were using it, we'd kick off a legal review or a business review is appropriate. And the developer could still go along with their regular work. They could continue to develop and build while those review processes are being kicked off. Then we provide them with any tools that are needed. So if they need a notice file based on the software they're using, we'll create that for them. If they need to put their source code somewhere to make it available, we have a place for that. We have a release checklist. So when they go to open source something, they can make sure they've dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's so that they're ready to welcome community and contributions. And then we try to incentivize good open source software behavior. Our developers, as John said, all want to be using open source and contributing to it. So we just try to add some extra incentives to help people do that. So for one, in our regular reviews that we do of employees, we actually ask questions of things like, did they build on the work of others? Did they help others? So things that are very similar to open source software and that open source software fulfills. We also have created programs. I put one example here of the FOSS Fund. So the FOSS Fund is a program where we earmarked some money, $120,000 for the year, and then every month we give $10,000 to an open source software project. But the really neat part is it's an open source software project that was nominated by a Microsoft employee who contributes to open source software, and it was voted on by Microsoft employees. So every month we donate to a project that Microsoft employees say is important to them and important to the company and could use some funding. We also have lots of internal open source community groups, everything from executives who meet quarterly to talk about open source software to open source champs that meet almost daily in chat, but probably monthly in a video call to talk about how open source software is going in their groups, to share best practices, and to answer any questions that anybody might have about how to use open source software in their groups. We also, as a best practice, have an open source software policy, like many organizations. And it's a company-wide document that we try to really clearly describe how people can use open source software so that they don't have to wait a week or 2 weeks for an answer. So it covers like how to use open source software. We're completely open in using it, how to contribute to it, how to release open source software. It has answers to common questions like how would I grow a community? Who should I talk to? Where should I put it? Who should be involved? And you can see a lot of this on our public website. So if you go to opensource.microsoft.com and you go under our programs, we've summarized our policy there. So if you're looking to create a policy for your company, that's a really good place to start. There are also other examples out there, but I encourage you to go there and feel free to ask us questions if you have them. And along the way, we've created a lot of tools. I've described some of them kind of at the high level, but I wanted to make you aware that of a couple projects that we have a project called Clearly Defined that I mentioned earlier. And Clearly Defined is a project that's right now, it has like the Eclipse Foundation is working on it. The company Bloomberg is working on it. The United Nations Foundation. And it's an API that lets you ask what license an open source software package is under. And that's really useful if you're a company that's using a lot of open source and needs to generate reports or needs to quickly check things. So you're welcome to use it. You're welcome to show up every other Monday. We have a team meeting. You're welcome to show up and ask questions or contribute. It's clearlydefined.io is the website. Another project that we created, our legal team actually started this, is called OpenChain. And OpenChain is really interesting because we had customers that would come to us and say, we know you're using open source software. We know there's open source software in the software that you're giving us. And we want to make sure that we're in compliance. We want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So we need to know that you're doing the right thing. And they would say, so can we see a list of all the software and all the licenses? Well, as I told you earlier, we're using over 5 million instances. So we wanted to give them this information in a way that was useful. We didn't want to give them, a whole stack of papers and say, here they are. So we thought about it for a while and we thought, automotive industry has the same problem. Like they have processes and compliance and safety procedures that they follow. And everyone knows that when you buy a car, all those parts follow a certain standards and have met certain safety guidelines. So actually started with our attorneys, reached out to the Linux Foundation and started a group called OpenChain. And OpenChain is now an ISO standard. So your organization can be OpenChain compliant. And it means that you've defined what the roles and responsibilities are in your company. Maybe it's an OSPO, maybe it's attorneys. You've defined that you have a policy and what licenses are okay. You said how you're going to remediate anything that goes wrong. You have a set of training that certain people take. And so now we can tell our customers that we are OpenChain compliant, and they can know that when they use open source software from us, that it's safe to use and it's in compliance with the license. So that's what we do internally, but it's also really important how we work externally, especially with open source software. And so I wanted to briefly touch on foundations. So Microsoft is a member of many foundations. This is just a subset of them. And the reason that we're members of them for many reasons, but some of the things I think are important is that foundations are a way for us to give back to the projects. So we give not just money to the foundation, but we also give time and effort. We always make sure that there's somebody on the Microsoft side who's engaged. It's also a way for companies to collaborate. It's a way for a project to clearly specify what their governance model looks like and how they want to work together. So foundations are an important part of making sure that the open source ecosystem is healthy. And we're a member of the ones that are important to us to help support those projects. John, is there anything you wanted to say on the slide or to wrap up?
No, that's great, Stormy. I'm really proud of all the memberships and all the things that we do in this space. And it's a lot of fun to be here today with you and talk about this.
Yeah, and if any of y'all have questions, you can find us on Twitter or you can ask us questions. Thanks for joining us today. And I hope wherever you are in your open source journey, that you either were inspired by something you saw in our presentation or it triggered another thought that you had that you'll share with others.
All right, cheers.